I'd spent more than 20 years as an investment banker, most of that in Islamic finance, before I really started to question the financial system fundamentally. And actually, I was a champion of Islamic banking for many, many years. I probably realized a bit late in my career that whatever product, whatever service I tried to provide with an Islamic format, with a Sharia compliant format, it would get repurposed, reformatted into a sort of reverse engineering of TradFi, fiat-based, fractional reserve banking-based, debt-based finance. And all of those are anathema to the fundamental roots of Islamic finance.
Hello, welcome back to Bitcoin for Professionals. This time it's a special episode. The tables have turned, and we've brought on Haris Irfan as a guest on the show. He's typically the co host, but this time, given Harris's journey in traditional finance to Islamic finance, I thought we can shed a bit of light on his professional career and how he got to where he is today. Haris, how are you?
I'm very well. It's nice to be on this side of the table.
Yes, yes, it's a pleasure to have you as always, and thank you for making the time today. So let's just jump straight into it and kick it off with basically your career. I know you
Mhm.
spent a lot of time in the trenches in traditional finance. You've co-founded the Islamic finance team with Deutsche Bank, and then you went on to co-found and act as the CEO, if I believe, of Cordoba Capital. So maybe you can start from the beginning. Tell me how you got into finance and what you focused on.
Well, if I'm honest, my preferred choice of career was because what was too hard for me to get into and paid very little. So I studied physics at university, and my final year was astrophysics. And I kind of lived and breathed that. And my dream was to be modeling black holes and observing the stars from an observatory in Palo Alto or somewhere. But of course, if you want that kind of position, you need to be a certifiable genius. And I, really didn't have that kind of level of expertise in that subject. At that time, we're talking early to mid 90s, a lot of maths and physics graduates there weren't a sufficient number of places in fundamental research in science, and they were moving into the city of London and making a lot of money as quants. So, I had the choice between being unemployed or being paid very little and having a very hard job and competing with geniuses, or competing with everybody else and earning a ton of money in the city. So it's sort of a no-brainer, I guess. And I ended up, working for a management consultancy firm, and then moving from there into investment banking. And actually, the work that I did in my early days in investment banking was, genuinely stretching and interesting. I did financial modeling in project finance, which is the financing of roads and railways and infrastructure and whatever. And I told myself that that was a noble pursuit because, we were building real things for real people, for society. So, I fed myself this not exactly a lie. I mean, they are useful things, but the manner in which society finances those essential things, I think, and we're going to talk about this, there is a fundamental flaw. But that's sort of my early journey, and I ended up in organizations like Deutsche Bank and Barclays Capital.
Yeah, so while you were there, working at major institutions, especially at, Deutsche Bank, I mean, you look everywhere, Deutsche Bank's reach is kind of global. Same for Barclays as well, especially when it comes to asset management and traditional finance. Is there a perception that you built around the system early on before you transitioned? Was there something that you felt was off, different? Maybe you can develop a little bit on that.
Yeah, I would say fundamentally the incentives are wrong. So these are places in investment banking is one of the very few industries where people are paid just for cleverness, just for solving problems, right? Which is why they take on maths and physics graduates. And that money making comes at the expense of everything else. There are no other stakeholders. It's all about just one objective, not even the primary objective, but just the single sole objective is making money. So you don't need to consider any other stakeholders, and those incentives lead to bad outcomes, in my opinion. you have an industry, the financial economy, which has diverged massively from the real economy where real goods and services are sold. So I think the fundamental problem here is whatever incentives are in place, they have nudged that industry in a direction that is bad for society generally. So although you have all these very clever people solving complex problems and making a lot of money out of that, they're not adding something beneficial to the economy. There's a very famous quote from a former head of the UK financial regulator, Lord Adair Turner, and he said that most banking is socially useless. And I happen to agree with him. One can certainly say that sometimes credit creation can be a good thing because it leads to certain outcomes, development of new technologies and so on, growth and so on. But I actually agree that most banking today is socially useless and has led to harmful outcomes.
Yeah, so this was during a time when investment banking wasn't as regulated as it is today, because there were quite a few blowups at the time, if I recall. So I guess the answer to that question was basically something just morally didn't align with your way of thinking and your way of being. Was that kind of the first personal connection with the system that pushed you to question and to want to separate from it? Because I know you are a big proponent and specialist when it comes to Islamic finance,
Mm.
especially with your work at Deutsche Bank,
Mhm.
where you had to structure uh, debt deals of some form,
Yeah.
right, in a way that was Sharia compliant. So maybe you can develop a little bit about that, because I think that will be a key component of the conversation in the second half of this session.
Yeah, so I'd spent probably more than 20 years as an investment banker, and most of that in Islamic finance, before I really started to question the financial system fundamentally. And actually, I was a champion of Islamic banking for many, many years. And I believed that Islamic finance, the industry in its contemporary form, was a good thing, and that I was capable of changing things for the better from within. It took me a long time to realize that that wasn't the case. I probably realized a bit late in the day, a bit late in my career, that whatever product, whatever service I tried to provide with an Islamic format, with a Sharia compliant format, it would get repurposed, reformatted into a sort of reverse engineering of TradFi, fiat-based, fractional reserve banking-based, debt-based finance. And all of those are anathema to the fundamental roots of Islamic finance. So, when I first joined an investment bank, I remember asking a senior person in the Islamic finance industry, hey, I've been made this offer in project finance. I think this is good because, we finance railways and roads and things and real things that people need. But I'm worried because I know riba, interest, usury, is forbidden in my faith. And how can I justify uh, being part of a system that, although the end outcome is supposed to be a good thing because we build all this infrastructure for society, that the means to that end are forbidden? And his advice, this is not necessarily the advice that I give to other people who ask me the same question, by the way, but his advice to me at the time was, if you don't learn these skills with this blue chip institution, how on earth are you going to change the system? How will you know how it works? How will you know the intricacies? How will you know how to design, build, and sell a financial instrument? You can't create something from nothing. You have to learn how to do it in the first place. So that was the advice that he gave me, and that's why I entered investment banking. And then once I was in investment banking, I got my lucky break with Deutsche Bank, and they sent me to Dubai. And all of our clients, or many of our clients, wanted to do Sharia compliant finance, and I learned at the feet of scholars. So I became a champion of that industry. I started to, evangelize this idea that Islamic finance and Islamic banking is a very good thing, and it's all based on halal contracts, which are supposedly risk sharing and Sharia compliant, and they're ethical and they're just, and we believe in equality and transparency and all these good things, right? But really, all I was doing was participating in the process of financialization, because Islamic banks are ultimately fractional reserve banks. So the products that they manufacture are essentially reverse engineered, debt based TradFi products. So That's why about 7, 8 years ago in 2017, I left the industry to set up on my own.
Hey, fascinating. So that's a regular occurrence or a trend, if you will, where we think something is good at the surface,
Yeah.
but then over time, as you start peeling the onion, you start to realize that there are certain flaws. And I can understand your point of view because at the time, there was no real Islamic finance or Islamic banking. And then this comes up, and as a young Harris, you felt like, I want to be a part of this. This is the industry that we need to be in, the industry that we need to promote. But I guess what would be the reason why they didn't put more thought into the infrastructure or the foundations of this system? Was it just easier to copy the current system and then to tweak it, like you said, reverse engineer it until it becomes Sharia compliant? I'd love to learn more about that. It sounds fascinating.
Yeah, there's a bit of a history lesson here, unfortunately. And that history lesson is there was an experiment in the early 1960s. It was an Egyptian economist who created a sort of a social savings institution. And he invited depositors to put money into this institution, and that money would be used to invest in local industry. And any profits that local industry made would be paid to depositors. So it wasn't an interest-bearing deposit facility. It was a true profit and loss sharing mudaraba type account, an investment management arrangement. And so that's a great experiment. And it was modestly successful. And 8 more social savings institutions sprung up in Egypt at the time. And but about 10 years later, mid 70s, you've got Dubai Islamic Bank as the first commercial wholesale Islamic bank being set up, and also the first multilateral, which was Islamic Development Bank. Now, of course, these have to operate in quote unquote the real world, which unfortunately is a fractional reserve banking world. And the regulator is the central bank, and the central bank is a fractional reserve institution. So if you go to the central bank and say, "Oh, I'm setting up a sort of risk sharing, profit sharing institution that's real economy based," it's like does not compute. Computer says no. This is not something they can wrap their heads around. It has to be a bank, and that means a deposit taking institution that makes loans and creates new money in the process. So we've got this very odd situation from the mid 70s onwards where Islamic banks have to behave like banks. And so you could say there's an argument to say it's not really their fault that they do what they do because they are constrained by the system, quote unquote. Um, but there's no momentum internally within those. There's no drive within those institutions to want to change, because scholars back for example, in the early 80s, they said it's okay for you to use these fairly synthetic contractual structures. One of them is called a commodity murabaha, sometimes known as tawarruq, which is basically a proxy for loan financing. And it involves a sequence of complicated, typically metals trades, a real underlying asset, because Islamic finance is supposed to be based on a real underlying asset. So you've got these movements of money and cash flows and metals on, say, the London Metal Exchange, not doing anything useful, but it's being done in order to create this sort of synthetic structure that is supposedly based by some real asset. And the end result is like a loan with interest. So the scholars at the time in the 80s said, hey, you know what? Just as an interim measure, just while you get on your feet and the Islamic banks establish themselves, we will allow you to do this. And later on, we'd like you to move to a purer structure, which is not a loan-like instrument, but is a risk-sharing instrument, which is more equity-like. That never really happened, right? So you got all these bankers and credit teams and traders and compliance departments and legal departments and salespeople all selling this commodity murabaha product, saying, yeah, yeah, our scholars signed it off. We can do this. And then for the next 50 years, they carry on doing this, which is crazy, right? Nobody ever wanted to change because you've got your approvals in place. So it's very hard to change that industry from the inside. They just want to operate like a traditional, conventional bank.
And that's not just with Islamic finance. That's, I think, just human nature.
Yeah.
Look at the temporarily suspension of the exchange of gold.
Yeah.
I mean, that temporarily has been going on for quite a bit of time. I
Yeah.
mean, so I think it's just easier to keep pushing forward with what you have and tweaking it slowly but surely than
Yeah.
to overhaul the entire system. And this is even within institutions themselves. I mean, the bigger, for example, an asset manager gets, the more time and money it takes to update their systems.
Yeah.
And so you have these huge institutions, and I worked as a trader at one of them. And some of the option trades that we used to have to do were done on this MS-DOS looking screen.
Hmm.
And it was just crazy. There was no mouse. I had to tab across every field. And this is a multi-billion, they had like 700 billion assets under management because no one wants to take on that project
Yeah.
because it involves a lot of costs, a lot of risk, and potentially upsetting a huge consumer base because if the product doesn't work and
Yeah.
it shuts down even for 5 minutes,
Yeah.
that's a huge loss.
There
So
are
I can
COBOL programmers from the 70s who are being called out of retirement to
yeah.
reprogram computer systems for banks today. Yeah.
That's just to show the inefficiency, and maybe this is a good segue because this is a misallocation of capital.
Yeah.
Again, show me the incentives, I'll show you the outcome. There's
Yeah.
really no incentive to improve the system. And so, one thing that you said that was very interesting, Harris, is that they had to operate in the real world,
Hmm.
which means they were intertwined and they were reliant on the US dollar currency because
Yeah.
the movement of money are on the US dollar rails that are connected between the central banks.
Yeah.
So I get that. And at the time, there was nothing that was sitting outside of
Hmm.
these rails. So this is a good way to enter into Bitcoin. I know you're a
Hmm.
big proponent of Bitcoin, you're a huge advocate and very vocal about it, especially tying it to Islamic finance.
Yeah.
Walk me through how Bitcoin came onto your radar. What was your aha moment?
Well, I guess I'd heard about Bitcoin, but only on a very superficial basis, sometime in the mid 2010s. But the first time I was really confronted with what is it and should I look into it was I was delivering a lecture in 2017. And it was one of my usual Islamic finance lectures. And at the end, there's a Q&A, and somebody in the audience asked the question, what do you think of Bitcoin? And I said, I have to be honest, I really don't know anything about it, meaningful. I mean, it's a sort of a magic internet money, right? And he said, well, actually, I mean, it has this characteristic and this characteristic and this characteristic. And I went, oh, well, that sounds a bit like gold. He says, yeah, it's digital gold. And I said, well, I mean, gold is the traditional money of Islam. There was a Islamic gold dinar standard for 700 years, and there was 700 years of civilizational progress. When Europe was in its dark ages, the Middle East was studying astronomy and mathematics and medicine and making huge progress in huge human social progress, right? Because that civilization had time and space because of the nature of its monetary system. So I went away and researched this, and that really was my aha moment. This is the moment in 2017 where somebody says, "Okay, you need to look into Bitcoin." And I went away and researched it, and I kept an open mind, and that was my big mental shift. And I realized that potentially this is better than gold because although gold is the traditional money of Islam because it's commodity backed, and a lot of people think that Islamic money needs to be commodity backed, which, by the way, is not true. But that's a generally held perception by many Muslims. There are many characteristics I've found which were superior. So we know gold today, and you were just talking about this, the idea that it was not only depegged in 1971, but prior to that in 1932 was expropriated, right? So gold is not really centralized. If Venezuela says to the Bank of England, I want my gold back, and the UK government says, no, thanks, mate, we'll keep it, I think. There's nothing Venezuela can do about that. So that's the problem with gold as a modern monetary standard, is that it's not truly decentralized. It would still be controlled by one party or a small group of people. So here I'm now being introduced to a type of gold that is better because it really cannot be manipulated or controlled. by one entity. And I know that today we're talking about strategic Bitcoin reserves and governments getting involved, and BlackRock owns God knows how much of this stuff. But really, I think the more and more people get into this, the more and more decentralized it becomes, and the more and more game theory says that we all have to get involved, and all the governments will get involved, and this million Bitcoins of the strategic Bitcoin reserve will actually never really happen. And I don't want it to happen because I don't want one government in control of it. And I hope, and I'm an optimistic person, I hope that won't be the case. So that's really the mental shift that I've had, and why I think it aligns with Islamic thinking. And now I tell people it's potentially the most Islamic form of money ever invented.
That's amazing. One thing though that should put you at ease. So if you look at the distribution of Bitcoin ownership, yes, nation states are coming in, yes, institutions are coming in, but for the first time ever, the individual moved before the big players.
Yeah,
And around 69% of the total Bitcoin supply is held by individuals,
yeah,
which is a good thing.
great.
And for those individuals to let go of that Bitcoin, they're going to do so only when it will improve their life. And some of them potentially never have to do so the more the world becomes, Bitcoin friendly. So when you can
Yeah,
start paying with your Bitcoin, you'll save in Bitcoin and then you'll expend some of that Bitcoin to live your life. So it's not just a savings vehicle. Right now it is, but like a lot of forms of money, there's multiple phases to its evolution, right? You
yeah,
can't become a medium of exchange and a store of value and a unit of account overnight.
overnight.
There's a progression to things, but that's really good. What would you say? So our podcast is geared for professionals,
Mm,
people across a variety of industries. It could be a dentist, it could be a lawyer, it could be an investment banker such as yourself. But you had your own personal journey with Bitcoin. And before we touch on some of the more personal stuff, I'm curious, what did you struggle with? And I'm wondering because a lot of people struggle with different areas around
mhm.
Bitcoin, but what was that component that you struggled with the most?
I think it's the idea that Bitcoin is not corporeal, it's not tangible in your hands. And I guess for someone who's grown up with the idea that there was an era of history in which gold was a global standard, and it was real and it was chemically robust and you could hold it and touch it and feel it. There's this idea that money needs to be something real. In fact, there's a famous hadith, a tradition of the Prophet ﷺ, which is that he said the that money, gold, silver, dates, barley, wheat, salt can only be exchanged hand to hand, meaning at spot value, not on a deferred basis with deferred payment. And therefore, what that hadith is saying is that you can't have riba, you can't exchange 100 for 110 at a later date, whatever your form of money is. And many people have misinterpreted that hadith to mean these are the only types of money. So therefore, gold and silver is a traditional best money of Islam. I don't agree with that. I don't think it says that I know it doesn't say that at all, right? What it's saying is those items that may be considered to be money may not be exchanged at anything other than hand to hand. That's what it's saying. So no riba, no interest, no usury. And nevertheless, traditionally, we hear many hadith about gold as being money. And so our perception is that money has to have corporeal essence. We need to see, touch, and feel it. And for me, Bitcoin was like, yeah, but I don't really get it. I mean, what's the blockchain? What's decentralization? What's the ledger mean? I mean, where do you store all this stuff? I don't understand. So that's the mental block that we all have to get over. And what's really interesting is there's a really nice analogy that I use on Muslims to convince them. Don't worry about the fact that you can't see, touch, and feel it. Because I say to them, how was the Quran assembled? From people's heads, from their memories. Now, you might say, oh, that's a bit unreliable. How do you know that it's accurate? Because if a million people are saying exactly the same thing in their head. I mean, here's another analogy. We all know a Beatles song, right?
Yes.
How is it we don't get the words wrong? I mean, if we got the words wrong, somebody would step in and say, hey, you got the words of yesterday wrong, right? It's actually really easy. All my troubles seem so far away, blah, blah, blah. We all know this, right? The Quran is much more powerful than that, believe me. right? So there are literally tens of millions, maybe hundreds of millions of people in the world who memorize lots of it. And every Ramadan, you'll be standing in a mosque in the nighttime prayers, and they traditionally recite the whole of the Quran during the month. And so the person leading the prayer is a hafiz, which literally means protector. He's the one who has memorized the whole thing. But if he makes a mistake, he's doing this all from memory, remember? If he makes a mistake, there's typically three or four or five people in the front row who can correct him. Now, that's amazing. What it means is you have a decentralized ledger of this book that hundreds of millions of people in the world have memorized, which means that if one person makes a mistake, you potentially got hundreds of millions of people who can step in and say, oh, no, that's wrong. There's no one single copy of it that sits in a box in a city in Saudi or Mecca or somewhere, right? In a glass box that everybody can inspect. No, it's all in our heads. And that's actually really powerful. That's a really powerful, decentralized, secure ledger. Now, I explain that to Muslims and they say, oh, so that's the blockchain. That's how a blockchain works.
Yeah.
All of these Hafiz, these memorizers, are the nodes. They hold the ledger in their heads. And when one steps out of line, everybody can say, no, you're wrong. That punctuation mark is wrong, right? It's as fine and detailed as that. And then the Muslims say, oh, okay, now I understand how Bitcoin works, and I'm starting to get on board with this idea.
I love that analogy. That's so powerful. Good thinking with that. I mean, yes, that is a decentralized form of maintaining information.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, Bitcoin is information that is
Yep.
stored across the world with different nodes, like you said, and each one enforcing the rules. If there's a mistake, everyone's going to gang up on that mistake and point it out.
Yep. That's right.
So that's great. And before we bridge Bitcoin and Islamic finance and dive a little bit deeper on that, has Bitcoin had an impact on you professionally and personally?
You know, I think that I've always been a low time preference person. I think that's part of the discipline of my faith. I think people who are religiously inclined and think about God and reward and afterlife, they tend to be people who exhibit low time preference and they save and invest in the here and now for their hereafter. So I don't think it necessarily changed me, but it certainly aligned with my fundamental belief. And I realized that Bitcoin is a low time preference form of money because it's anti-inflation, it's anti-riba, it's proof of work. It is something that encourages saving and investing for the future, and for future generations, not just our future. So part of it is about, protecting the environment, protecting the planet, being stewards of the planet, which is also a very, Abrahamic concept, right? We are not here to kind of slash and burn and desertify our planet. We're here to protect it. And I think Bitcoin encourages that mindset. So it's very much aligned, I think.
That's great. Yeah, I mean, Uh, it changes some in a transformative way, but like you said, if you are of faith, any type of faith in general, you are typically a low time preference because you're thinking about also your children,
Mm,
inheritance, who are going to leave behind. And for me personally, Bitcoin was just like you said, I worked in traditional finance my entire life, and
mm,
something just felt wrong.
yeah,
And then you get into Bitcoin, you understand it, you look at it, and then it just feels like a burden has been lifted on your shoulder. You
yeah,
feel more genuine. And I think if Bitcoin keeps doing what it's doing and protects people's purchasing power, energy, and their labor, we become better stewards of our
yeah,
planet because we have more time to think about bigger things outside of our daily struggles because
yeah,
we can't make ends meet as a result of inflation or as a result of being pulled into debt for certain circumstances because not everyone is taking advantage of debt in a way where they're like, oh, I'm going to take this loan and do this. Some people are forced into it due to either family circumstances, health circumstances, and then they're stuck. And I think, like you said, the system is kind of geared to push us in that direction. And when you own Bitcoin, that becomes something you don't want to be a part of. Like you'd rather, cut down and not extend yourself because you know that you don't want to miss out on savings and thinking over the long term.
Yeah, it's also interesting that you have institutions like the IMF and the World Bank who continuously, release propaganda and FUD about Bitcoin. And of course they do, because a majority of the world is heavily indebted to a minority of the world. And that debt is keeping them down. So whilst these organizations have stated goals, which are
Mm.
very lofty and noble, and we want to develop the underdeveloped world, we want to introduce sanitation and healthcare and women's rights and education and all wonderful, lovely things. The reality is those countries get worse and worse and more indebted, and a much higher proportion of their GDP is spent servicing interest repayments to the IMF and others. So the IMF acts in exactly the empirical outcome is exactly the opposite of what they claim to want to achieve. And it's that whole modern monetary system and debt-based system, based on US dollar imperialism, frankly, that is causing this state of affairs. So I see Bitcoin as a sort of freedom money that reverses that decline and hopefully equalizes the world a little.
It's funny you mentioned the IMF because I can't think of any country that has taken money from the IMF and that has actually grown
Hmm.
or improved. Like not one. And if someone can point one out, please send it my way because I mean, Lebanon is constantly taking money from the
Yeah,
IMF and
yeah,
it's just getting worse and worse and
yeah,
worse. And
yeah,
you'd think that, there's a book about the IMF. I think it's called something along the lines of Stories of an Economic Hitman,
oh yeah,
and he goes through what they actually do and their actual intent
yeah,
outside of the lofty narratives you
yeah,
described. So, yeah, but on that topic, today, the European Union, which is something I noticed. I want to see if you agree with me. Every time Bitcoin goes through a drawdown or some form of correction, the European Union releases some comment about how Bitcoin is not suitable or is bad as a. They mentioned something today about it being a economically useless and that the ECB will never hold it as a reserve asset. And it's funny because literally today and the day before, the ECB released a historic loss on the balance sheet 2 years in a row. So they outdid themselves compared
yeah.
to last year. And they're talking about instability, volatility.
It's just crazy. It's just, I mean, just the data is enough, should be enough to convince anyone with an ounce of logic, right? In any 3-year period that you see for Bitcoin, it's up. You
Yeah.
look at the volatility of it since 2009, and it has been following the same trajectory as gold from 1971.
Mm.
That volatility is coming down and down and down, and now it's at the level of tech stocks.
Yeah.
So it's amazing to me that the ECB and Christine Lagarde and whoever will continue to say this kind of stuff. It's just a blatant lie. It flies in the face of the data, the evidence. That
And they're racking up losses all the
Yeah, I mean,
time.
easy.
But
Carry on. They're gonna fail. This is gonna fail, and
yeah.
we're just gonna anyone who accumulates Bitcoin in the dips is gonna be happy.
Yeah, and I agree with that. So that was just a small anecdote because I saw that today and I found it quite ironic. But let's jump into the meat of it. So, Bitcoin and Islamic finance.
Mhm.
So we've touched on some of the problems you've seen with the current Islamic finance system. You've written extensively about it in your book, Heaven's Bankers, which I recommend everyone reads. It's quite fascinating to see actually how things work within that space. But in your view, how can we integrate Bitcoin into a truly Islamic finance system? Can it be done? If so, what's your views on how it can be done?
Yeah. Well, Bitcoin is about money as a medium of exchange and store of value. We know that, right? And the roots of the Islamic economic model is that money cannot be created out of money, or for that matter, out of nothing. So it requires proof of work, which is why traditionally gold has been the money of the Islamic empire. It was something real, and it was an asset. So proof of work is a requirement. Proof of work is Sharia compliant. It's Islamic. Bitcoin is anti-riba because of that. It's anti-inflation because of that. You can't create it from nothing. You can't flood the money supply with it. And if you go back to the roots of the Islamic economic model, the roots are trade, real goods and services. And the contemporary Islamic finance industry is all about reverse engineering, TradFi, replicating financialization. So I think that if we were to look at the fundamentals of Bitcoin as a low time preference money, so therefore it's kind of spiritually aligned with the way that Muslims think. If you look at it as a proof of work form of money, which means that it requires work to extract it. You can't create it from nothing. You can't flood the money supply. You can't create inflation and therefore inequality and injustice on the people. You don't allow those closest to the money printer to get richer. So this Cantillon effect that we have with modern monetary systems is a pure injustice on people. So this really, really aligns with the fundamental concepts of the Islamic economic model, which is, money is a medium of exchange and store of value. It's anti-inflationary, it's anti-riba, and it encourages real trade with a long-term savings and investment mindset. It's low time preference. So really, I mean, it's absolutely in alignment with Islamic financial principles.
So I'm just thinking through this. We take out the fiat foundational layer. We replace the settlement layer with Bitcoin on chain. That way, that is your savings account. Each individual, as part of the bank, would have their public address. So there's full transparency. You can confirm at all times that there's no rehypothecation, which means there's no lending, meaning there's no financialization of the underlying asset. And then with some of the new infrastructure for Bitcoin that's improving all the time, like Lightning, you can have a checking account of sorts that allows peer-to-peer or quick transactions at a low cost. And also, and you can tell me that, so right now in the banking system, and I'm not familiar with Islamic banking, but I'm assuming when you transfer, when you move, there's a cut that goes to the bank, which is a fee. And correct me if that would be considered uh, non-Islamic because there is some form of asymmetry there. But with Bitcoin, the fee market is actually a free market, which would allow, so it's not unfair in a way where you're being charged for just moving money on a screen, basically. You're actually, bidding based on how urgent. So is that type of because you can build on top of that financial products, but I guess right now the problem with the system is that the layer one is being manipulated, meaning anything you build on top of it in some form of way, doesn't matter what it looks like from the outside. If the core is corrupt, then the product is corrupt. But you're saying if Bitcoin at the layer one is the money within the Islamic bank, then whatever you build on top of it will more likely than not be aligned with Islamic principle. Is that correct?
Yeah, so I think this is the big challenge, right? It's a practical challenge. How do we create financial institutions that sit on top of Bitcoin? And we have solved, Satoshi has solved the monetary side of the equation, right? This money now exists and can be used as money. How do we solve the financial institution side of this? And I see a lot of digital asset specialists creating so-called halal DeFi applications. And I'm not convinced by many, if any, of them. And I see a lot of them are sort of crypto-based rather than Bitcoin-based. And for me, that's just a complete no-no because you're now introducing the white noise of fiat-like financing in a digital format. So, I mean, really, I think the only solution here is Bitcoin as a fundamental base. How do we then incorporate it? It's not going to happen from the Islamic banks because, as we say, fundamentally, they are fractional reserve institutions. Their job is money creation. That's how they earn. And therefore, it's not enough to simply overlay halal contracts on top of a fractional reserve institution and say, magically, we are now Sharia compliant. The core is wrong. So now that we know there's a core that is right, a form of money that can't be created from nothing and has to be mined and requires proof of work and has all of these other good characteristics, we have this practical challenge of creating financial institutions that know how to use and understand Bitcoin and want to use it as a base, but are creating truly risk-sharing products. So the Me Too movement within Islamic finance is these little Islamic fintech startups coming along and saying, hey, I've got a lending product that's Sharia compliant, and yet it's financed by TradFi credit lines, and it offers business financing, let's say, on a commodity murabaha basis. Remember, this was this particular proxy for loan financing with interest that I mentioned earlier that developed after the 70s and 80s. So you have this situation where these guys are coming along and saying, yeah, this is great technology and a great form of money, and now I'm going to produce a DeFi, which is halal, but I'm going to give you a form of financing which is essentially asymmetric. It's a borrower-lender relationships, which is exactly what the banks do. It's not a partnership relationship. It's not a what they call a mudaraba, which is an investment management arrangement where one party is the manager of capital and the other party is the investors of capital. And you give it to the manager with a certain set of parameters, and you say, we'll split the profits and losses afterwards, which sounds very simple in theory. But when you suggest that to a banker, it blows his mind. And I know this because the company that this is not meant to be a blatant plug for what I do, but the company that I run is a company called CCM, which has created a financial instrument that I call a true sukuk. Sukuk is a type of Islamic bond, and the team that I work with at Deutsche Bank was responsible for developing that market in the early 2000s. The problem with sukuk, with Islamic bonds, is that they have become bond-like. So they have a coupon that is like a bond. They have a profit rate that is benchmarked directly to LIBOR or other interest rates. They claim to have an underlying asset as the basis for their rent generation, but actually that asset has nothing to do with that rent. It's the obligor credit, the credit of the party that says, I promise to repurchase the bond, i.e. the company or the government that's raised this bond. So really, how is it different from a bond? Whereas what we've tried to do at my firm is to create a financing instrument that is truly risk sharing. So based on this concept of mudaraba, this risk-sharing arrangement. So now you don't have risk transference from one party to another. You have risk apportionment across parties that are best able to manage them. So now we're partners. The financier and the investee are partners in this venture, and it requires them to do a lot more due diligence on this venture. If you go to a bank and says, okay, I need 100, and he says, okay, pay me 110 back next year, he doesn't really care what happens in between because, he'll repossess your house if he has to, right? So it doesn't matter to him if it's a good or bad venture. He'll throw, good money at bad. It's bad money at bad, in fact. So that's a fundamental misalignment of incentives, whereas a risk-sharing arrangement, a true trade-based, real economy, risk-sharing financial instrument, which is the essence of Islamic finance and actually the essence of all ethical finance. So I don't even like to use the word Islamic or Sharia compliant or Arabic words in the product that we market because it's not for Muslims, it's for everybody. The same goes for the companies that are raising money, right? So if we can marry that concept, that financial, sophisticated, modern capital markets financial instrument with Bitcoin on the other side, that I think is the ideal marriage. And that's what I would like to see happening.
And I think slowly but surely, outside of Islamic finance products, Bitcoin, like you said, allows for ethical financial products. So, if I'm not mistaken, the first UK pension plan to allocate to Bitcoin 3%, they had a similar request where the asset manager actually only makes money if the pension plan makes money.
Right.
So there's not a yearly performance fee or a yearly management fee. Basically, if Bitcoin underperforms and the asset manager doesn't, and the pension doesn't make money, then the asset manager takes nothing home.
Yeah.
And that aligns incentive because that's basically the asset manager telling the pension plan, you should allocate to Bitcoin and we're going to play this game alongside you. We will only start generating revenue if you generate revenue.
Yeah.
And above a certain threshold, we take our cut. If we don't generate any revenue, no one generates revenue. So we're in this together. So that's a very profit sharing type of environment. And there are too few of them around because, there's this incentive for asymmetry within the traditional finance
Yeah.
world. And it's
Yeah.
very difficult to convince your boss or your boss's boss or your boss's 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 boss to leave money on the table,
Yeah.
because at the end of the day, there's a yearly bonus and everyone wants to take home a nice paycheck.
Yeah.
But I like this approach, especially what you're doing with CCM.
Mhm.
It's a great way to kind of move away from the current system and maybe start incentivizing or encouraging others to build better systems.
Yeah.
I'd love to see a Bitcoin bank that tries to push this and that specifically targets, individuals that are more ethically inclined, that understand the problem with the current system. And this is not just a Islamic problem, like you said. This is really a everyone problem.
Hmm.
Because
Yeah.
once you understand how money works, it's unethical to everyone that you're losing 2 to 7% on a yearly basis of what you earn during that year, that it's being siphoned away from you.
Yeah.
So I love that. Now that we're really deep into this component, in Islam, scholars are incredibly influential, and Muslims look to them for guidance. And this is a similar structure in many religions. But in your view and in your experience, because you explained earlier that you worked a lot with scholars early
Hmm.
on in your career within the Islamic finance, it seems that, based on my views, there's a lot of conflicting views within the scholar realm around
Hmm.
Bitcoin. It seems that they might be confused with other digital assets. They can't clearly create a distinction between them. But if you were to sit down today with a very reputable scholar, and they were actually a little bit open-minded about Bitcoin or to learn about it, where would you start to try to convince them to take it seriously?
I think everybody has different motivations, right? So if a person's motivation is, let's say one of their hot topics is the tragedy that's unfolding in Gaza and Lebanon right now, and you say to them, well, actually, Bitcoin fixes this because it's a form of freedom money that can't be manipulated by others. I mean, I've tried to donate to, medical aid and food on the ground in Gaza, and we tried to do it through banking channels, which get blocked because they deem it to be a high risk transaction. So the only way that we were able to get money to assist people on the ground was via Bitcoin. And, when I explain this to a scholar, they may not know this. They may realize that actually this is an example of protecting people from an unfolding tragedy. Similarly, you can give them the example of the Afghani reserves that were frozen by Biden's government a few years back. So when the Taliban came to power, there were $7 billion sitting in US banks. And Biden unilaterally decided that not only will we freeze this, but I think we'll give it away to the family or the victims of 9/11. I mean, what did the people of Afghanistan have to do with that? It was nothing to do with the Taliban either. So it was a fact that we don't like your government. So we've decided that we'll steal your money. And people starved during a very harsh winter. That was literally murder. And how can you justify murder on the basis of freedom and equality and all this kind of stuff that the West likes to trumpet about? But in fact, there's nothing of the sort. So I say to some people, well, Bitcoin is freedom money. It's free from manipulation. It's free from sanctions. It's free from censorship. It allows people to live their lives the way they want to live their lives without interference. And for some people, that works. For other people, economic arguments work. It really depends on who I'm trying to motivate. Scholars, I think, are I I have some sympathy with those who have been incumbents within the Islamic finance industry and tend to repeat what pro-government economists are telling them. They don't know any better and they haven't been exposed to anything else. And their job is not to innovate. Their job is just to uphold the standards of the Sharia. It's really practitioners who innovate. And at some point, practitioners innovate and people take up that innovation and it becomes a movement and everybody adopts it and scholars will just have to keep up. And that's happened in history. At various times, scholars have banned certain technological advances because they simply didn't understand it. When loudspeakers or the telegraph wire was introduced, they thought it conveyed the voice of the devil, right? So, I mean, this just becomes a silly discussion. And at some point, people with common sense say, I don't need to listen to this. I think I'll just adopt Bitcoin because Bitcoin's a good form of money. And eventually, when millions of people are using it, the scholars will say, "Oh, I'll write a white paper about this, and it'll say how wonderful Bitcoin is." Mate, you're too late. We're already using it, right?
Yeah, and this is common because, in a lot of, even at the family office level, in families as well, similar to any industry, any specialist expert industry, uh, there's generational change.
Mhm.
So what is currently taboo or haram for certain scholars may not be so haram or so taboo for the younger generation of scholars that are actually born into this technology. Because
Absolutely.
I think people are afraid of what they don't understand.
Yeah,
And
absolutely
I
right.
think that's the biggest problem. And then telling someone who is more on the elderly side to put their neck on their line, and they've built generations of reputation to
Yeah,
upholding something that is sacred, sometimes might be a bit too much to ask of them.
yeah.
I mean,
But
just, yeah.
you know what I find disappointing is that we had some very venerable, senior, more elderly scholars who gave you the usual FUD, and they would rant about it having no government backing and no undertaking and nothing real behind it, and it's extremely volatile, and all the arguments that are easy to rebut, so easy. I mean, the government backing thing is hilarious because even the Bank of England on its own website says a shopkeeper is not required legally to accept a £10 note if it doesn't want to, right? So, there's no backing or undertaking by any government. It's just nonsense. So it's actually disappointing because these scholars are spoiling their own legacy by saying this stuff. They built up decades of trust in their word and their legal opinion as a mufti, as a deliverer of a fatwa, a legal opinion. And they've spoilt it with this new technology by spouting nonsense. And now you've got a new generation, as you say, of scholars, younger, more tech savvy, more familiar. And actually, they're embedded within the industry. So they are, part of the management team of new Islamic fintechs, for example. They understand how this stuff works. They're at the coal face, the cutting edge of new digital assets and new financial instruments. And they understand how business works and financial institutions work. And they are writing, very good things about Bitcoin being potentially a very Islamic form of money. So that's an optimistic view of it, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult not to be optimistic because Bitcoin has been attacked. I don't know how many times it's been labeled as dead over the last 15, 16 years. And every time we feel, it's at risk, it comes back exponentially stronger.
Hmm.
And I think the state of the world is playing a big role in that
Yeah.
because you look everywhere, vast majority of people are struggling, housing affordability. People can't even afford homes. You have two parents that have to work two full-time jobs, each 80 hours per week. They barely see their kids, and then barely they are making ends meet. I mean,
Yeah.
life has lost a lot of its purpose, which is have a family, enjoy life, spend time in the now, not worrying constantly about your
Yeah.
deadline or your meeting and stuff like that. But yeah, I mean, I like to be optimistic, and hopefully will come to fruition the way we perceive it's going to be.
Inshallah.
But Harris, we're hitting almost the 1 hour mark. Before we wrap it up, this was a fascinating conversation. If there was one thing you'd like our listeners to take away from this conversation, what would it be?
I think it would be stay open-minded. Um, I think modern economics is it's not a science, it's really an ideology, and a lot of it is just received wisdom. So if one remains open-minded, one can see through that received wisdom. It's a little bit like the priest speaking Latin in medieval times.
Mm,
The word of God was conveyed by Christian priests in Latin because, well, the lay people couldn't understand it. So the
mm,
priests were the intermediary. And, then you had a Reformation and you had various things happening and people started to see things differently. But as long as economists are those priests speaking Latin and obfuscating the truth, then we will always have this handed down received wisdom. And I think that There was actually a recent article in the Financial Times about the new standards that might be applied to the sukuk industry.
Mm.
And the comments underneath are fascinating because there is the usual mix of Islamophobic nonsense, people talking about beheadings and stuff. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't know where people get off on this, but
Yeah.
some people just are puerile. They don't want to debate the policy.
Yes.
They'd rather play the player, not the ball.
It's just the
And
trolling that
it's just
because
it's ridiculous. Even in the Financial Times, which you expect
yeah.
people to be grown up,
You think people are professionals and people are gonna be,
it doesn't
looking
work
at
like
the
that.
no, nothing at all.
Yeah.
Like that's the internet.
So the comments are interesting because those comments that are actually, reasonably put forward, a lot of people are saying, why do you need this? Religion and science do not mix. Religion and finance do not mix. Modern economics is really good. It works like this. I had a discussion with somebody on my LinkedIn profile where I had just sort of pasted this Financial Times article to put a link to this article. And, the response was very much, fractional reserve banking has worked very well for us. We should just do incremental changes because it's very good for society. It's credit has done all of these things. And I'm like, dude, the empirical evidence is exactly the opposite of what you said. You're relying on the received wisdom of the priest speaking Latin. Whereas you should go back to the fundamental roots. What is the word of God? Read the word of God. Read fundamental economics. What is trade? What is money? Once you start to answer these questions from first principles, you realize that the modern system is just totally screwed, right? And you couldn't possibly, if you were an alien from Mars landing on this planet and you saw fractional reserve banking, you would say, dude, that's a fraud on the people. That's an injustice. You got to change this system.
It's a
Uh,
Ponzi scheme,
yeah,
literally.
yeah. So I think people should stay open-minded and question everything. Don't trust, verify. And that's what we do as Bitcoiners.
100%. That's really good advice. Thank you so much, Harris. I know people can find you on Twitter, LinkedIn, author of Heaven's Bankers. Make sure to check that out. Anywhere else, and they can find you. I know you have a page as well, I think, for Cordoba Capital on LinkedIn as well.
It's ccmarkets.com, ccmkts.com.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Harris. Pleasure. It was great to have you on the other side of this conversation. And we'll see you next week, guys, where both Harris and I will co-host, hopefully, another episode of Bitcoin for Professionals. Thank you for
Thanks, man.
joining.
Cheers.